Hello and welcome to this presentation on the Regency Townhouse's kitchen in Hove it's just near Brighton. We just first slide. So in this presentation I'll be looking at how the kitchen was restored. We'll be looking at how that kitchen was used in the past, and we'll be flying right up to date and seeing how the kitchen is used now. Just a few bits about me. I'm Paul Couchman and I'm one of the volunteers that works at the Regency Townhouse. I studied art and art history in Amsterdam. We set up a restaurant there as well, a squatters restaurant. I do social media for the Regency Townhouse, and basically this project is combining my love of history together with my love of food. Now, how was the kitchen restored? Well, that's a massive project. I'll just tell you where it is first. So this is a cut-through model of the Regency Townhouse, which is in Brunswick Square. The bit we're really interested in is the basement. So this is the servants' area below. And if you were to enter here today, if I took you on a guided tour, you'd come with me, and we wouldn't go in the front door. We actually go down here and down the steps there into the basement. And there's a door here you go through. First room you come across is the housekeeper's room. There's a staircase, there's a servants' hall after that, and then you follow along here. This room here is called the butler's pantry. There's a back staircase here, and the kitchen is right at the very back of the house here. And there's a few points, I'll point it out in later parts of the presentation as well, but we've got stables here at the back as well, which is amazing. So that's also part of the main house. So there's a whole story behind the townhouse and the curator who bought the basement as the first part of the project back in 1984. And when he arrived in 1984, the kitchen was in a very sorry state. He tells us very gleefully stories about how the kitchen was full with chicken poo that was waist height and also moved a bit. So him and loads of other people, he had lots of friends helping him right from the start, emptied all the chicken poo out with great big wheelbarrows, and then this was left. So the pictures you see here is just after they did some initial cleaning up. The place was derelict. You can see the roof is collapsing there. So all of this is in a really sorry state, and all the plaster on the walls as well actually crumbled off and had to be removed. So we move on to here. So look, you can see the ceiling has been completely taken away. These rafters are replacements. They've kept some of the old wood you see here, but a lot of the wood was rotten and had to be replaced. So that was in the 90s. And again, the whole project stopped. There are problems with funding. It's very difficult to find funding to restore places like this. So the project stalled again in the 90s. And that's when I came in about 6 years ago. So I helped out with the final stages of the kitchen. So we put back, you can see, we put back the plaster on the walls. And this is all lime plaster, original techniques we used as well. You can see here, lath on the ceiling, and that was covered in plaster. And the whole thing was put back together again over a period of 3 to 4 years maybe. And then we got to this point. So it was this point, there was no actual... So the kitchen was restored, or for example, the scullery had been put back. This fireplace had been recreated, but there was no real purpose for this room. So it was ready and it was waiting for something, but nobody really knew what. So let me come back to that in a minute. But now we go for the middle section. How was the kitchen used in the past? Well, there's various functions of a kitchen. Food storage, but it didn't also happen in the kitchen. It also happened outside of the kitchen. So here's a few examples of where food was stored outside of the kitchen. So we've got these cupboards that were in the housekeeper's room. That's the first room I showed you on the tour in. That's where the housekeeper kept expensive items away from the other servants. So they would be under lock and key to prevent theft. And things like jars of pickles and preserves would be kept here in her room. And she might actually take a part in creating them as well. And also we have this food storage outside in the yard. So we think maybe it was used for veg. and that is actually very beautifully, that is a part of the yard that's still intact. So we had to restore it completely because it really rotted down, but all this is restored wood with some new additions, but that's what would have been outside. So it's a food storage area. But we've also got storage inside the kitchen as well. And there's mainly two sections to remember for food storage. You have something called a dry larder and you have a wet larder. And these are, in this case, they're right next to each other here. So inside the kitchen, so if you go through here, into here, you have a dry larder. And that actually gets a bit of sun there as well. That is warm. That's a warm section of the larder. Over here, that's just going out of the door here, you have a second section which would have been bricked off. There's a brick partition between these two areas. This area here is the wet larder. So that's where things like meat, fish would have been kept. So anything that needed to be kept cool. And the other section is where things needed to be kept that were dry. So that's the distinction, wet and dry larder. And you also get larder and pantry from that. So larder is this section here. So if you remember, lard is lard. So that's the wet side. Pantry is, it contains in it the word pan for bread. So that's the dry section. So that's how you remember the difference between larder and pantry. So that's a little lesson for you there. And we also have this section here where the range would have been. So this is the main cooking implement or the cooking place in the kitchen. You've also actually got another cooking area here next to the range, which would have been a copper. So you could have boiled puddings in the copper. But the main cooking would have been done in a sort of steel, it's basically a steel box with heat attached to it, or heat inside it. Look into the fire there. They're great. I mean, I've heard stories from people who actually used them. They give a great heat. It would have been very new technology at this point in the 1830s. Very expensive, and only really for the very, the richer houses. So in the courts, in the Royal Pavilion, places like that, they had very large ranges. We've got a sort of medium-sized one here. Look down here, in that picture, you can see a very large one. This is the sort of range that would have gone here. And if you really want to see what would have been here, you only have to go to one of the houses in the square who has an old range in their garden. And their garden would have been originally been a kitchen, but the kitchen was demolished. And so they have now in their garden the range. And if you look here, which is lovely, if you look here, you can see a dark mark on the wall inside my chimney. That's where the range would have been. You see the oven has sort of burns a scorch mark onto the wall there, and that's still there to see. So that's the range that would have been there. We also have at the back of the kitchen a scullery. So this is where the washing up would have been done. My grandma still refers to or is still referred, I should say. She's no longer with me, obviously. My grandmother referred to the scullery, the kitchen as a scullery. But basically, in this case, it's a place where they do the washing up. And you can see we've got a lovely picture here of somebody doing it. And here we've got the lovely Fiona, who's one of the volunteers, who is standing in the same place and doing the washing up in the same place as the scullery maid would have been doing that in the 1830s. And what's lovely is that you've got a sort of repetition of history. The light shines down, lights up where she's washing. And it's the same light. It's coming from the same windows that it would have been in the 1830s. So there's a real sort of sense of time travel when you're actually just doing the washing up. You're standing in the same place that people would have stood in the 1830s. And those sort of things excite me. I hope they excite you as well. So how is the kitchen used now? So I told you back then, didn't I? The kitchen had no purpose. So yeah, I mean, really was my idea. It was my idea to start using the kitchen as a kitchen. And luckily the curator, who's a wonderful person, decided that was fine. And so what we do in the kitchen now is, and this started with humble beginnings, obviously. So we're actually using the kitchen to produce food for events we do. For example, Dine Like a Servant, which is an event we held in the old dining room. So we actually sat all these people together and recreated the food that the people would have eaten in the dining room in the 1830s and made it in the kitchen. And I don't know, there is a sort of famous person in here. So if you know Zach Pinsent, who's a Regency tailor who's quite famous, he came to our first meal. So that was quite an honour, really. And that's the dining room, which is in a lovely shade of sort of purple. So what do we do in the kitchen? Well, I try as much as possible to use original sources. So I've got a marvellous collection of cookery books. Many of them have been just given to me. People turn up at the Regency Townhouse with books and say, you must have this. You know what to do with it. And what I've got here, this is the first one I really treasure. It's an 1830s manuscript cookbook, which is basically a collection of recipes that somebody has maybe got from other sources. They've copied from books and they've put together to form their own collection. And if you look down here, you can actually see the very beautiful handwriting that's in there. And these are wonderful. There's even a recipe in the form of a poem in that book, which is lovely. Here's another very battered copy of William Kitchener's, the kitchen, let's see, I think it's the Kitchen Oracle. It's behind me somewhere, here we are. It's called The Cook's Oracle and Housekeeper's Manual by William Kitchener. This is a paper copy, a sort of modern copy, and this is an old one which I managed to get, which is falling apart, but marvellous photographs. And I also have these, what you get with old cookery books sometimes, you find other people's recipes in them. So we've got a wonderful recipe for plum pudding that somebody wrote on a bit of paper, stuffed into the book, and then it's been handed on to me, so that's very precious. And here I've got another book just been given to me. Again, it's behind me up here as well. But it's a Victorian cookbook, I think from the 1890s. Lovely printed book, but also even lovelier in a way are these pieces of newspaper and magazine cuttings which have been put in them by a cook from Wales. So I know something about the woman who originally had this Victorian cookbook, and she used it to collect recipes in her life. And I still have these recipes as well. So it's another bit of history as well. So you've got the books themselves, and then you've got all these little additional extra bits which make it very special, I think. So here's a close-up of the manuscript cookbook that I've got here. I'll just show you, if you can see on the little tiny screen there, that's the book itself here, which is in my hands now. But just look how beautiful the handwriting is. And I've got some meat recipes. All these old books are full of meat recipes. There's a recipe here to collar a pig's something and a mock prawn recipe as well. I haven't tried all these recipes out yet, but obviously we want to do that. We want to do it in the kitchen. And also, I mean, there are lots and lots, and again, a lot of them are here. There's lots of books, sort of secondary sources where people have taken old recipes and then we updated them perhaps, or provided extra information about them. And here's some of my favourites here. So this one's lovely, and I will talk about this in another presentation, but that one's especially about puddings. So the whole book on historic puddings. This one comes from a project in Canada which we were involved with. There's a lovely one here about jellies. I mean, the history of jelly. Who wouldn't want to know more about jelly? And this one is great because it's actually about seafaring recipes as well. So things that sailors might have eaten. And when I say sailors, I mean all the people on board. So you go from the working classes right up to the elite. So a load of very interesting food in there. I don't just do it alone. It's not just me anymore. I'm very, very lucky, and I really do love the fact that I'm not alone in the kitchen anymore. We've got all these lovely people who come and join us, especially for the dining events, and dress up and take part. This one here, especially, I should point out, is she's known as Mrs. Finnegan. So this is Bridget, but she dresses up as Mrs. Finnegan, and Mrs. Finnegan is a character in her own right. And in another presentation I'll be giving together with Bridget, we'll be talking more about Mrs. Finnegan, the housekeeper. But basically, we all love dressing up. Well, who doesn't? And we love performing. And when we're serving the food, we like to pretend that we're servants too. And the house really is suitable for that, I think. So here's a few more. We also do tea shops. So we have a tea room in the kitchen. I mean, my main aim in the kitchen is to use the space and to bring people together. I just think that's so important. And also to populate a space that was empty for so long with happy people. So we've got some happy volunteers here. And over here, we've got some happy people that came on a course I gave as well. So I did a course making Bath buns, which was, and if you haven't had a Bath bun, they're delicious, but Bath buns made in the Regency kitchen. And there's me and all the people showing off their buns. So just a quick update on what's happened to the kitchen. So I told you that it was derelict. We built it up. We started working in it. And then obviously COVID hit. Two disasters. You get COVID-19. Hopefully if you're listening to this in the present, it will be a distant memory, but at the moment it's still quite prevalent. We've got a second wave coming as I make this presentation. So we get COVID, and then we get a flood. We get a flood of biblical proportions. And here's some little pictures of the disaster that's hit the kitchen now. So one of the reasons I'm doing these presentations is to ask people for donations so that we can put the kitchen back together again. And hopefully when all the restrictions have gone, we can actually start cooking and having courses and having tea rooms in that space again. Oh, just hopefully soon. So I don't know if you can hear this video. You might be able to actually. So there was a little video there of me, which I might play again. So I've explained in this presentation, I've explained how the kitchen was restored. So with a lot of volunteer effort, and we've got incredible expert guidance, of course, from the curator Nick Tyson. I've explained very briefly how the kitchen was used in the past, and I've also talked about how the kitchen was used and hopefully will be used in the future for doing all these dining events, for the courses, for the tea rooms. And it's all, I should say, all these events we do is to try and raise money for the townhouse so that we can carry on restoring it and carry on putting it back together again, and also carry on telling stories about history. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Tell everyone about the townhouse, and do have a look at some of the other presentations I've been doing as well. And they're on YouTube, they're on Twitter, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. Thanks very much for listening.